taking our discussion of the brain, we're staying within the central nervous system, and we're just moving down, sort of. We're moving ventral and then inferior. And you know what I mean because you know the directional terms, right? That's good. So as we go through this chapter, a lot of this will cover or be more detail for some of the stuff that you learned in lab. The purpose mainly is to learn about the cranial nerves and then the spine. Cranial nerves, you only really looked at 3 or 4 in lab. I'm going to be a stickler. I want you to learn all of them. Cranial nerve structure and function. You're going to talk about the anatomical features of the spinal cord, how it achieves the job of being a conduit to convey information between the brain and the rest of the body. We'll discuss functions of the spinal cord and how it can automatically maintain some characteristics of homeostasis. And lastly, and maybe, we'll talk about spinal reflexes. This might get pushed to our discussion on special senses. We'll see. But spinal reflexes are automatic, below conscious awareness, at the level of the spinal cord where sensory information comes back. And it helps us out in a lot of situations. We'll talk about that mechanism probably in this section. By far, the first major topic is that of cranial nerves. Cranial nerves. They originate from the brain, from the central nervous system, but they are technically in the peripheral nervous system. You could make the argument that one of the cranial nerves is part of the central nervous system, but the rest are all peripheral. They generally pass through structures in the skull and control muscles in the face, the head, and the neck, and then relay sensory information in the face, the head, and the neck as well. Cranial nerves, face, head, and neck. Like with any good rule, there is an exception. There's at least one cranial nerve that goes inferior to innervate the visceral organs as well. It's the exceptions that are more memorable when you learn them. So this table in your book lists all the information you need to know. Cranial nerves 1 through 8 here. Each one is given a Roman numeral to identify it. You have information on the type of signals being conveyed by that nerve, where that nerve, no, it's not where the nerve is, we'll show that, but what the actions are of that nerve. 1 through 8, 9 through 12. Olfactory, optic, oculomotor, trochlear, trigeminal, abducens, vestibulocochlear, glossopharyngeal. What's the last one? No, the 9th one. Hypoglossal, vagus, accessory. No, vestibulocochlear, glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, hypoglossal. And the reason that I can stumble and then go back to figure out how or where I was in the naming is from this really fun mnemonic that the book gives you. There are other more risky mnemonics that you can find online that I'll leave to your discretion if you want to use those. But a mnemonic is just a memory device that helps you remember the order of things. O, to touch and feel very green vegetables. Remember that, you can remember the cranial nerves. O is tricky. You have to remember olfactory, optic, oculomotor, trochlear, trigeminal, abducens, facial, vestibulocochlear, cochlear. I always have trouble with that one. Glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, hypoglossal. You get it. You can remember the names. You could probably even do that leaving class today. Easy. Learning these 12 nerves is easy. The next thing you need to learn about them is what kind of information. They're one of 3 types of cranial nerve. Sensory nerve, motor nerve, mixed nerve. Sensory, motor, mixed. Oh, that makes sense. There are nerves that just bring signals back, nerves that control muscles or glands, or some of both. How do you ever remember which nerves contain which information. Sensory, sensory, motor, motor, both motor, both. Motor, both. Sensory. I forgot about it. I'd write it down. Some say marry money, but my brother says big brains matter more. Write that down. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 through 12. Sensory, sensory, motor, motor, both, sensory, both, motor, motor. I just looked at the sentence. 80% of your job is done, maybe even 85. You'll eventually just get used to the idea that vagus is number 10. Trigeminal is number 5. The one that we always forget about is number 11. It's accessory. Optic's number 2. You'll start to remember that information. This is an easy way to do that. So we're going to discuss each of these briefly. O. It's an O. It's one of the olfactory, optic, oculomotor. I've just memorized the order. It's olfactory. Some. It's sensory. This one is a special sensory nerve because it's conveying information from our special senses. Olfactory is our sense of smell. Brings olfactory information to the brain. Other special sensory nerves are optic, which is number 2, conveys visual information. And then number 8, which is the vestibulocochlear, auditory information. Doesn't change that they're sensory, they're special sensory. So the olfactory nerve, you can see depicted here. There are bipolar neurons that extend through what we call the cribriform plate. It's part of the skull, one of the bones of the skull. It has a bunch of little holes that nerves dangle down through the epithelium to the superior surface of the nasal cavity. And the dendrites of those nerves pick up odor signals. So odor signals are these little red dots. They activate the dendrites. The signal gets sent back to neuronal bodies in the olfactory bulb, which you've probably seen in lab or will if you haven't had your lab yet. And those are sent to the brain. Olfactory information. Now we talked about this a couple times. There's inputs from here. This smell information goes to the habenular nuclei in the lateral geniculate, or what's the word? In the epithalamus. Habenular nuclei of the epithalamus, and also to the limbic system, which is why smells convey or relate so much to emotion and memory. You can see these dendrites dangling down below that are active in response to odor senses that depolarize and then make some impression on the nerves within the olfactory bulb. And the type of nerve that's depolarized, or the net sum of nerves depolarized, relates to what smell you sense. Sweet, sour, sharp, mild, floral. So many senses. These are also generally numbered in order from anterior to posterior. And on each of these figures, you'll see the brain, the ventral side of the brain on the left-hand side with the highlighted nerve. Olfactory is obvious. You saw it in lab. The bulbs are these projections that extend along the midline and are fairly obvious to see. The ends are where the nerves are extending, and that cribriform plate would be on this ventral surface with the nerves poking out away from the screen towards you. Optic nerve conveys sensory information related to the eye. O, and some say. Optic nerve, sensory information. And you've gone through this in depth. I won't spend a lot of time on it. Basically, rods and cones which respond to colored or the intensity of light. depolarize and send signals through the axons in the retina to the optic nerve, which is relayed to the brain. You'll have a lot more information in lab about this. This is a recap. This is the nerve that is technically or arguably a tract of the brain, a part or a budding off of the brain. You could argue this is part of the central nervous system. It's a projection of the brain. But we consider it as a cranial nerve and include it with the rest of them. Defining features here, the optic chiasm, the X on the ventral surface of the brain. As visual information returns, the medial fibers actually cross over. Lateral fibers stay on pace. But they all end up in the occipital lobe at the primary visual cortex. These are the ones that relay through the lateral genicular nucleus. So you've been exposed to this before. Let's move on. Oculomotor. A lot of these names describe their function. If you didn't know what oculomotor did, you could probably guess it has something to do with moving the eye. Oculo, eye, motor. Obvious. Moving the eye. O, my third O. Some say Mary. This is motor. Motor information. This slide is kind of a 3-for-1. You see Trochlear and Abducens down here as well. They're all generally involved in actions related to moving the eye. But we're going to still go through these in order. Mostly vertical and medial eye movement. Vertical and medial eye movement. So the oculomotor nerve has a couple branches, superior and inferior, and the muscles on top and the bottom move the eye up or down. Up or down. There's also some innervation of the medial rectus muscle, the medial muscle that moves the eye, which allows you to move it towards the middle. You can either look left or right or cross your eyes. That's oculomotor. I'll just do the lecture like this now. Other functions is that we control the eyelids with this muscle, opening and closing the eyelids. Rather open in the eyelids. And the ciliary muscles that help focus the lens, and the iris, which changes the aperture or the pupil to allow light in to be sensed by the optic nerve. All of this motion in the eye due to the oculomotor nerve. No matter what anyone says, this is a motor nerve. Let's move on. 002, trochlear, nerve 4. Some say Mary money. M, motor. She must have found the questionable mnemonic. 002, trochlear. Some say Mary money, motor. Trochlear, also involved in eye movement. Here, PNS activation, non-voluntary control of accessory muscles of the eye. This is the smallest cranial nerve, and as such, it's generally overlooked. It has a non-conscious, non-voluntary function, so it's hard to imagine what it does. And even the muscle, the oblique muscle, is not something that's easy to interpret or to understand what the eye does. So we're going to call it an accessory muscle to help stabilize the eye. That's all we care about for the trochlear nerve. Good, we like little information, right? No depth, no detail. We're taking a break from muscles of the eye. Fifth nerve, trigeminal, 002, touch. Touch, fifth nerve. Some say Mary money, but. Both afferent and efferent signals. Both sensory and motor nerves, or neurons in this nerve. This is by far the largest cranial nerve, the most obvious cranial nerve, and you've seen it in lab. It's It arises from the border of the pons, and it's got this large ganglion, this large body that projects just off to the side of the pons that splits in three. And maybe the brains that you saw in lab didn't do that. Maybe they were cut in half, or some of the branches were cut off. Trigeminal, three twins, essentially. Three branches, three main branches: ophthalmic, maxillary, mandibular. And I don't have a fun acronym for these other than It's kind of like nom nom nom. So they're involved in chewing and muscles of the face, sensory muscles of the face. Throughout, I should probably mention, throughout, as I'm presenting these little blurbs for you with their colored backgrounds, blue or sensory, red or motor. So far, it hasn't mattered. Sensory, sensory, motor, motor. Now we're in both. We have motor and sensory, so I want to differentiate that. This lines up with our discussion of impulses in the spinal cord as well when we get there. So the ophthalmic branch gives sensory information on eye position, proprioception of the eye. Maxillary branch innervates the sensory information from the upper jaw, the cheeks. When I touch my face like this, I'm sending information back to the brain through the trigeminal nerve, the maxillary branch. There's also sensory information in the mandibular branch coming from the lower jaw. So we've got upper jaw, lower jaw, position of the eye. We don't have any motor information yet. The only motor information comes from the mandibular branch, involved in chewing, muscles of chewing. And the names of the muscles aren't necessarily important yet. The trigeminal nerve, the mandibular branch, activates the muscles to chew food, to close the jaw. Largest cranial nerve, probably the most numerous branches, largest variety of functions. Trigeminal. It's a big one. It's important. Number 5. Abducens. Abducens. The name here isn't obvious. It doesn't tell you what it does immediately. Abducens abducts the eyes. What does abduct the eye mean? Lateral movement. When you take something away from the midline, you abduct. Abduct. Steal. When you add something to the midline, you adduct. Adduct. And maybe you're thinking about the gym. Abductors, adductors. You do the, not leg raises, but abduction or adduction, where you sit on the machine and you have the pads that you push out or bring in. Abduction or adduction. Abducens abducts. Lateral movement of the eye, taking it away from the midline. So a small role. But appreciate here the balance that has to occur between this and the ocular motor nerve, which mediates medial movement of the eye. Lateral versus medial, two different nerves. You can't activate both at once. You can't abduct and adduct. It's not possible. So there has to be a nice coordinated approach to moving the eyes left and right. Yet we can still do it easily, right? Again, fairly easy nerve. Abducens. Abducens is the one that arises the inferior border of the pons, and it's on the ventral surface. It's easy to notice the abducens nerve. It's kind of lost in the noise because it has a small role. It's a pretty small nerve. It's not that important, but it's right along the ventral surface. You can see it coming up here. It sticks out. It's obvious. Abducens. Facial nerve. to touch and feel. Nerve 7. Some say marry money, but my brother, also both. Sensory and motor information. Next to trigeminal and vagus, this is one of the more highly branched nerves. We haven't talked about vagus yet. Facial nerve. Facial nerve probably innervates the face. What about the face does it do? Facial nerve largely responsible for taste, sensory information related to taste. The anterior 2/3 of your tongue, the taste buds, send information back to the gustatory areas of the brain via the facial nerve. That's the sensory information of the facial nerve that we care about, taste. Facial nerve also controls the muscles of facial expression. Somatic motor control. That makes a lot of sense. Facial nerve makes faces. Raise your eyebrows, narrow your eyelids, smile, frown. Facial nerve. Control the muscles of facial expression. We have control over those, obviously. We don't have control over the parasympathetic activation of tear glands and salivary glands. Not immediately obvious, they're part of the face. Tear glands, salivary glands. Facial nerve controls the face. The one that I can't say, vestibulocochlear. Did you guys all, you got this information? I'll put it up. Changing in 3, 2, 1. Vestibulocochlear. Again, it's in the name. Vestibulocochlear. And maybe the name doesn't make a whole lot of sense to you right now. We'll start to know what vestibular means and cochlear means when we talk about the special senses. There are two main branches of the vestibulocochlear nerve. The vestibular branch, and you guessed it, the cochlear branch. That's easy. The vestibular branch relates to our sense of equilibrium. You probably already know the inner ear has information related to balance, or it sends information related to balance. If I tilt my head back, I know it's not level because of the information coming in via this nerve. I can maintain my balance largely when my eyes are closed because of the actions of that nerve. There's also proprioceptive information coming from the feet, the limbs, my posture, but a lot of it is from this vestibulocochlear nerve. Cochlear branch conveys auditory information. The inner ear also allows you to hear. Of course it does. Auditory information that allows you to hear my wonderful voice, these wonderful words, interpret this information, and learn it, know it, love it, right? Cochlear branch. All sensory. All sensory. We care about this being sensory. That's it. I wonder if we can finish all 12. Maybe. to touch and feel very green. Green. G, Glossopharyngeal. Nerve 9. Some say marry money, but my brother says big. B, it's both. Motor and sensory. Start with sensory. Can't forget the last third of the taste buds. Glossopharyngeal. Again, the name implies its general area of action. Glosso is a prefix that relates to the tongue. We'll see that again when we talk about hypoglossal. It's relating to the name of the tongue muscle itself, but that's not important right now. And then pharyngeal, of course, the pharynx. So we know the areas where this is active. The posterior third of taste buds, And this is one nerve where there are branches that go outside of the immediate head and neck. This is an important nerve as we talk about the physiology of controlling blood pressure and heart rate and respiration. This is one of the nerves that sends signals about those situations in the body through carotid bodies and aortic bodies. And where they are, well, it's in the name. We don't care a whole lot about them other than they give us information on pressure and oxygen saturation and things like that, help regulate homeostasis. This is one of the nerves that does that. Blood pressure, because I have it written down, baroreceptors, like barometric pressure, monitor pressure. Baroreceptors monitor pressure. Pressure specifically in the arteries. When we talked about negative feedback loops, if blood pressure is sensed as being too high, it signals from these baroreceptors that tell the brain it's too high. Oxygen in the blood, sensed by chemoreceptors, a chemical receptor. We think of oxygen as a chemoreceptor, or as a chemical. We'll learn more about those later. Motor information controls the muscles of swallowing in the pharynx, and also some activation of salivary glands. And you can see some of the names of the muscles and structures, but again, we're deferring our discussion of those in detail until later. Now, along with the glossopharyngeal nerve and its innervation of the aortic and carotid bodies, the vagus nerve travels along with it. And the vagus nerve is probably responsible for the majority of signals coming from those areas. You can think of the glossopharyngeal as a backup. All I want to point out in the last under a minute of class, not even a minute, look at the structures on this slide. Not central, not face and neck. Intestines, stomach, liver, lungs. This is the exception that we talked about of the cranial nerves. Not just head, face, and neck. This is elsewhere in the body. We'll talk about its role when we come back to class tomorrow. Have a wonderful Thursday.